I wanted to take some time today to talk about how to test logic statements. A lot of times in our code, we have to figure out when to use true-false statements and Boolean statements, really. And they're often difficult to challenge when we have a lot of code going on in an application. So, a form app where we have different text boxes and we have to test text box 1, text box 2, text box 3 and see is there data in them. We have to validate the code. And that can be pretty challenging to test and make sure that your logic statement is working properly in a form application. So the best way to do it is to take the logic statement outside of the form application and test it separately in just a straight up console app where you would input your variables hard-coded. Go ahead and do an example of that. I already opened up my project, but I'll go through how to do it again. You just go to new and new projects, and when it comes up, I'm not actually going to do this, but just to show you, you go to Visual Basic, because we have to use Visual Basic for this class. But if it doesn't matter the language, whatever language you're doing, the concept is still the same. So I mean, you would still do this in C++ or C#. And you go to the console app, name it, and that's all. So I've already did those steps, and now we're sitting here. First thing I want to do is go ahead and write some variables to simulate my my text box, and so I'm gonna do that right now. I'm gonna go ahead and do this, and then I'll come back. So the first thing I did was I created a variable called t, and on line 5. I initialized it as a Boolean. I declared it as a Boolean, and it's true. And the second variable is s as string. So the first one is just going to be, I named it t because it's going to be my testing variable. So I mean, we can comment that just for, I would normally do this, but this is just for training purposes. This is going to be my output string. And then here I declared 3 variables. These are going to simulate 3 text boxes. So you could consider this text box 1, and this will be text box 2, and here would be text box 3. So here I set my Boolean, my testing value, I just set it, defaulted it to true. I had my output string, I just defaulted it to empty. And my 3 variables that are going to simulate my information in text boxes, I went ahead and let's go ahead and enter some data, some information. So all of them are going to have some data. 1, 2, and 3 is going to be the input. And again, this is just simulating if I was in an application, a Windows Form application, that I'm taking data from a text box. And that's all this is doing. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create 3 more variables, and I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll be right back. What I did was I declared variable xt, yt, and zt, and they're just variables that I made up, and they stand for these 3, x, y, and z, my inputs. And I put t at the end to just mean testing, so you could think of this as variable x testing, variable y testing, variable z testing. I set them, I'm going to declare them as Boolean, and I set the values, I assign the values to true. And these are just my default values. The reason that I did this is because I'm going to be testing these variables to see if they return an is null or an empty value. And so let me finish this code, and I'll be right back. So what I did is on lines 12 and 14, so these 3 lines right here, what I did was I went ahead and declared my testing variables for each of the 3 inputs to a Boolean. They're initialized and declared Boolean. I assigned it to the output or the returned value of is null or empty, and that's just the Visual Basic function for testing the input of x, y, and z that I have up here. And so this is saying if it's empty, if it's null or if it's empty, then return true. That's what this is saying. And the same for this one here. So you could, let me go ahead and put this one on top because it applies to all of them. It applies the same to all 3. Okay, so if there is null or empty, then return true. And so that's what's happening here. So it's going to test these inputs to see if there's something there. Now we know there's something there. We're purposefully hard-coded it to 1, 2, 3 because we want to test it manually and see what's going to happen. So if there's nothing there, let's say that this one here was empty, then line 13 right here where it tests X would return false. That's all that means. Okay, so let's go ahead and put that back up there. I'll write a little bit more code. So I have this if statement that I just threw in here. And so what this is saying is these 3 Boolean values that are either going to be true or false, I'm looking to see if they're all false. And if they're all false, that means that they all have data. And if they all have data, I'm going to set the testing value to true to false. I could set it to true. It just depends on my logic on how I want to output this. But what I'm really doing here is I want to know, do these three variables have values? And again, these could be the equivalent of a text box .text, and I want to know, is there something in there? And so, as I said here, if it's null or empty, it's going to return true. So in this case, what you could say is, let's put a comment here, is if all 3 return false, meaning they contain data, then return false. Okay? So in one line of code, I'm testing all 3 outputs from here, and I'm going to return false if that's the case. That I did was I wrote this select statement right here. And so this is saying I'm going to select T, so this T that's returned, and I want to know if it's true or false. Yes, I could have written this in an if statement, but just to be different and try and use a select case statement, that's why I did it this way, so you guys could get an example of an if and a select statement, a case statement. And so here they are, both types. So I evaluate T, and if T is true, then that means that one of these text boxes doesn't have something in it, and we're going to return an invalid entry. So I'm going to assign S, my output string, to invalid entry. If T is evaluated as false, then I want to say all good. And all good just means every one of these returned false. All of them have data. And so they all contain data, return false. We evaluate T as false. We're going to output all good. And it's really that simple. Oh, and so at this point, if I was to run this, it's all going to work, except for it's going to compile and go away. Because since this is a console application, we need to output our results somewhere. We don't have a Windows form. There's no text box to output to. So when it's a console app, we have to tell it that we need we're going to be using the console. So just type in console, and then the syntax is right. In our case, S, we're going to output the string, and also going to output the read key. Now the read key just means pause, is all that means. Okay, so we're going to output S, the results of S, and have and then pause the console. So let's run this now. And our return is all good. All 3 of these text boxes have data. Well, and they're not text boxes. They're hard coded to simulate a text box. And so everything comes back good because every one of these had data, and the data was all evaluated here as false. 3 falses. 3 falses equal a false. The false down here equals all good, and so everything is fine. All right, let's do some different. Now, whenever you're testing a logic statement, we have to test every possible combination to make sure that our logic is working. So let's say that there wasn't any information in the first one. Let's run that. Should come back as invalid. And here we go, invalid entry, no good. All right. Well, what about if there's 2 missing? Should come back the same. And there it is. invalid entry. All right, let's do 3. And we get invalid entry again. Excellent. All right, let's put just 1 up on top. And it's still invalid. Okay, excellent. Let's put 1 in the middle. And still invalid. Excellent. All right, now this time it should come back good. And we get all good. So this is just a really simple way to test your logic statements. And by your logic statements, what I mean by that is this part right here. Because it can be difficult to decide, how are my Boolean statements being evaluated? 3 falses, 2 falses, a true and a false. There's different combinations of your logic statement. And so you don't want to test this inside of your actual application where you're using it. You want to test it separately where you can hard code it and very quickly evaluate it. And once you have this working the way that it output, because you need to test every different possible input, you need to test all of them. And when you've tested every different combination and everything is outputting exactly the way that you want it to, then all you need to do is cut and paste your logic statement and cut and paste it into your solution and then put it to use, where you would actually be using it in a Windows Forms application, actually testing the text boxes. And so that's a real quick and simple way to use the console application to test a Boolean statement. And of course, there's different types of Boolean statements you could make. And yes, there's different ways that you could do this. This is just an easy way that I set it up to test for a Boolean statement. So I hope you learned something, and happy coding.